Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined, they're real. Moab, Utah, a small town wrapped in red rock cliffs and desert silence. People come here to disappear from traffic, stress, cities, and cell service. But in August of 2021, two women disappeared for real. Not metaphorically, not spiritually. They vanished from a forested pocket in the LaSalle Mountains, and 5 days later, they were found dead. Bullet wounds, exposed, left in the open. Their names were Kylan Schulte and Crystal Turner. Newly married, known by many in Moab's tight-knit community, both lived a lifestyle that blended minimalism with movement, what most people today call van life. They rotated campsites, parked in safe spots, and respected the land. They weren't reckless, they weren't lost, and they weren't running from anything. According to friends and coworkers, Kylan and Crystal were seen together for the last time on the night of August 13, 2021. They had a drink at Woody's Tavern, a local bar on Main Street. Surveillance footage showed them leaving around 9:30 p.m. No one followed them out. No one in the footage looked suspicious. The night on the surface was uneventful, but something had already shifted. In the days before their deaths, Kylan had confided in multiple friends that a strange man had been watching them at their campsite near LaSalle Loop Road. She didn't know his name, just called him that creepy guy. She mentioned that he had parked too close, acted erratic, made them feel unsafe. At least two friends recall her saying they were thinking of moving their camp because of him. She never got the chance. What followed was 3 days of silence. No texts, no social media activity. Crystal didn't show up to work. Kylan didn't return her father's messages. In Moab, where people often go off-grid for a weekend, that might not raise alarms. But this time, something was off. On August 16, Cindy Sue Hunter, a friend of Kylan's, became concerned enough to begin her own search. She knew their usual camping areas. She drove into the mountains alone, calling out their names and checking roadside clearings. By August 18th at around 11 a.m., Cindy found a scene she would never forget. 30 feet from a dirt turnout along the South Mesa area, she spotted a body in the brush. It was Kylan, clearly deceased. No movement, no breathing. Further along a dry creek bed, she found Crystal, dead as well. Both women had been shot multiple times. The Grand County Sheriff's Office secured the scene within hours. Technicians from the Utah State Bureau of Investigation were brought in immediately. A mobile forensics unit was deployed before sundown. The initial forensic readout was concise. Kylan and Crystal had sustained multiple gunshot wounds. Both appeared to have been shot at medium range. There were no signs of blunt force trauma, restraint, or torture. Autopsies would later confirm neither had consumed drugs or alcohol before death. Toxicology came back clean. Forensics noted a disturbing consistency. Neither woman had visible defensive wounds. There were no signs they had tried to run, fight, or shield themselves. That suggested a sudden attack, an ambush. No struggle, no escape. The site presented limited forensic evidence. No shell casings were found at either body. That suggested the shooter collected them or used a revolver. There was no blood pooling near Kylan's body, which raised an immediate concern. Had she been shot somewhere else and moved? Had the scene been staged? The lack of blood made it difficult to pinpoint the exact location of her death. One unsettling detail stood out to investigators. Both victims were partially unclothed from the waist down, but there was no sign of sexual assault, no semen, no DNA that didn't belong to the victims. Crime scene analysts marked the staging as possibly symbolic or psychological, not sexual. One forensics expert later stated, "The presentation felt deliberate, but it didn't match any clear sexual or ritualistic pattern. This looked like anger with a message, not desire." The van the couple had lived in was parked nearby. It hadn't been tampered with. Their phones were recovered inside. Wallets, IDs, camping supplies, everything intact. Nothing was stolen. No signs of forced entry. No prints, no blood inside the vehicle. Whoever did this didn't come for things. They came for them. Grand County detectives interviewed neighbors, campers, hikers, and businesses across Moab. No one had seen the women after they left the bar. No witnesses recalled hearing gunfire. But a remote motion-triggered wildlife camera, located approximately half a mile from the scene, had captured the sound of 3 distinct gunshots on August 14th at 11:48 a.m. The timestamps were verified. Analysts confirmed the audio matched the acoustic signature of 9mm fire. That became a cornerstone of the early timeline. Colleen and Crystal left the bar on Friday night. They were killed sometime before midday Saturday. Investigators built a time frame, August 13th, 9:30 p.m. Last seen leaving Woody's Tavern. August 14th, 11:48 a.m. 3 gunshots recorded. August 16th, Crystal fails to show up for work. August 18th, bodies discovered. At this stage, police had no suspects, no murder weapon, and no motive. Theories were few and shaky. A random drifter, a disgruntled ex, a serial killer? Nothing fit. Moab wasn't a place with a history of hate crimes. There were no prior attacks in that area. But something felt off. The sheriff's office released a statement. "We do not believe there is an ongoing threat to the public at this time." The community didn't buy it. Moab residents held vigils. Protesters gathered outside the sheriff's department demanding transparency. Signs went up. Justice for Kylan and Crystal. In the absence of answers, rumors filled the void. Some believed it was a hate crime. Others speculated about drug involvement, though nothing in the toxicology supported that. A few pushed wild theories involving survivalist extremists in the mountains. But one line from Kylan's friend kept resurfacing. She said they were being watched. That became the emotional and investigative pulse of the case. Not what happened, but why they knew something was coming. To experienced homicide detectives, that detail was crucial. Victims who report being watched before a murder often know their killer. That doesn't mean the killer is a friend. It means the killer was close enough to observe, track, and act without resistance. The creepy guy mentioned by Kylan days before her death had never been identified. No sketches, no name, just a vague warning and an open grave. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit was consulted by the end of August. Their input was cautious but consistent. This appears to be a single-actor killing. It was organized, personal, and sudden. One private note from a Grand County deputy, released later via FOIA request, read, "The data aligns too cleanly. Sometimes that's the problem." Meaning, this case looked like it had no loose ends, because the killer had closed them in advance. In homicide work, time doesn't just pass, it erodes. In the first 72 hours, evidence holds memory. After that, it becomes a guessing game. And by the time authorities took this case seriously, the clock had already run too long. On the morning of August 16th, 2021, Crystal Turner missed her shift at McDonald's. She had never no-called before. Her manager logged the absence. No one thought it was fatal. Kylan Schulte's father, based in Montana, had already sensed something was wrong. She hadn't returned any messages since Friday. No activity on her social media. Her last text had said they were moving camp because of a man nearby who was making them uncomfortable. She didn't provide coordinates. Her friend Cindy Sue Hunter was more direct. When Kylan didn't reply to texts and calls for 2 days straight, Cindy drove out on her own to look for them. She knew the general area, LaSalle Loop Road, Geyser Pass, South Mesa. The couple often camped in semi-legal spots outside of the established campgrounds. Remote, but not impossible to access. That drive changed everything. Cindy's cell signal dropped shortly after she entered the foothills. She relied on instinct, previous trips, and a gut feeling that something wasn't right. At approximately 11:01 a.m. on August 18th, she spotted a silver Kia van parked off a dirt turnout. No movement, no smoke, no sounds. She stepped out. A few yards into the brush, she saw something in the undergrowth. A human arm. She dialed 911. Dispatch relayed the GPS coordinates to Grand County Sheriff's Office. Units responded within 45 minutes. What they found was confirmed by photographs, drone scans, and handheld body cams. Kylan Schulte was lying face up, shot multiple times, body partially obscured. Roughly 40 yards uphill, Crystal Turner's body was found near a dry wash. Same condition, same manner of death. This wasn't a missing persons case anymore. It was a double homicide. Forensic teams from Utah's State Bureau of Investigation were dispatched immediately. Within 4 hours, they began logging all visible evidence. Drones mapped the terrain. Perimeter markers were placed. Nothing was moved until full documentation was complete. Key forensic angles established that afternoon. No signs of animal interference. This ruled out post-mortem disturbance by wildlife. No significant blood pools at either site. Indicates likely execution-style shooting and body placement. No shell casings located. Suggests the killer either used a revolver or retrieved them. Digital forensics. The couple's cell phones were located inside their locked van. Neither device had been used since the night of August 13th. Technicians performed rapid field scans on the van. No fingerprints on the door handles other than the victims. No forced entry, no damage. No recent travel data in the vehicle GPS. Everything stopped on Friday night. This led to the construction of a critical timeline anchor. Last digital activity. August 13th, 9:41 p.m. Gunshots recorded. August 14th, 11:48 a.m. Bodies discovered. August 18th, 11 a.m. This was not a crime of passion. The spread between the van's location and the bodies showed clear intention. Crystal was dragged across uneven terrain. Soil impressions indicated backward movement. Likely her feet were pulled. No tracks from a vehicle. No tire impressions. The killer was on foot. Interviews began the same evening. Co-workers, neighbors, hikers, bar patrons from Woody's. The couple's last confirmed sighting was still the bar. No one reported an argument, a tale, or a threat, but a statement from Kylan's friend stood out. She said a man had parked too close and was watching them. That note was flagged and elevated for behavioral analysis. Without a description, investigators couldn't create a sketch. They couldn't ask the public to help identify someone whose face they didn't have. But the behavioral profile began forming. Male, solitary, confident, knew how to enter and exit undetected, and someone who wasn't improvising. Detectives pushed for tower dumps from all nearby cell towers between August 13 and 14. That request went to the FBI for technical support. The results wouldn't come for weeks, but the fact that it was done became a quiet win. Later, it would provide unexpected alignment between tower pings and a name not yet mentioned in the case. But on August 18th, law enforcement had no suspect, no weapon, and no clear motive. At a press conference that night, the Grand County Sheriff said, "We are treating this as an isolated incident. There is no known threat to the public." He was wrong. By August 19, 2021, the crime scene in the La Salle Mountains had been fully secured. With the victims removed and the initial surface sweep completed, state forensic analysts began Phase 2, the forensic breakdown. The bodies of Kylan Schultz and Crystal Turner were transported to the Utah State Medical Examiner's office in Salt Lake City for autopsy. Simultaneously, the physical scene was revisited using grid pattern analysis to isolate ballistic data, surface impressions, and secondary trace materials. This was no longer about what was visible. It was about what had been left behind when someone thought they'd taken everything with them. Ballistics was the first major lead to surface. The forensic team recovered 3 9mm bullets embedded in soil and tree bark near the creek bed. They were deformed but intact enough for rifling pattern analysis. All 3 matched the same barrel type and bore wear. The patterns suggested a compact semi-automatic handgun, not a revolver as originally theorized when shell casings weren't recovered at the scene. That changed the narrative. If a semi-auto was used, the absence of casings likely meant they were manually collected post-shooting. That level of post-crime control shifted the profile from spontaneous to organized. The Utah Department of Public Safety's firearms lab later confirmed the rifling marks were consistent with a Taurus G-series pistol, one of the most widely available 9mm handguns in the U.S. It wasn't a unique weapon, but it did narrow the scope. Gunshot residue, GSR swabs collected from both victims were positive, confirming they were shot at close to medium range, between 3 to 10 feet. No evidence of contact shots, no powder burns on clothing. The shooter had kept distance and control. That mattered. It suggested confidence, familiarity with the weapon, intent to kill, not to threaten. The bodies told the rest. Kylan had sustained 4 gunshot wounds, 1 to the upper chest, 2 to the torso, 1 to the left shoulder. The fatal shot passed through the heart. Based on wound trajectory and depth, She was likely standing upright and stationary when shot. There were no defensive wounds, no bruises, no indications she'd fought back. Crystal had 3 entry wounds, 2 center mass, 1 to the neck. Her injuries were fatal, with the neck shot severing the carotid artery. Autopsy confirmed she died within seconds. Like Kylan, she showed no defensive trauma. Both women were caught off guard. No sign of a chase, no signs of restraint. This was sudden and silent. Clothing analysis provided one of the few puzzling variables. Both women were found partially disrobed from the waist down, yet there was no forensic evidence of sexual assault. No bruising, no lacerations, no foreign DNA. That detail remained unexplainable by physical evidence alone. Crime scene reconstruction placed Kylan's likely point of injury within 8 feet of where her body was found. Soil disturbance and bent foliage confirmed she collapsed where she stood. Crystal's body, however, had been dragged roughly 30 feet downhill. Soil compression, track depth, and residual fibers suggested the dragging occurred post-mortem. The person who moved her did so quickly, likely using both arms or gripping from under her shoulders. No wheel marks, no mechanical assistance. This was done manually. A new detail emerged in the process. 1 boot print, partially compressed into loose soil near Kylan's final position. It was not a match for either victim. Analysts noted a deep heel impact and shallow toe mark, suggesting the person stood still, possibly aiming. The tread pattern was commercially common, Vibram-style sole, typically found on hiking or tactical boots. There were no identifiers specific enough for a brand or model, but it was preserved in a cast and archived for later comparison. It was the only confirmed print not belonging to either woman. Meanwhile, digital forensic analysts began processing the phones recovered from inside the van. Neither had been unlocked or accessed after August 13th at 9:41 p.m. Call logs were clean, no recent unknown numbers. Last app usage was a text conversation with a friend about feeling creeped out. The message was vague. No name, no location coordinates, no time commitment. That lack of digital breadcrumb was significant. In homicide cases involving mobile users, digital devices often bridge what physical evidence can't. Here, the void was stark. The devices had been untouched for days. There was no attempt to erase or manipulate anything. That suggested the killer either didn't know about the phones or didn't care. That suggested speed or arrogance or both. The FBI's behavioral unit received a case file transfer from Utah State Police on August 20th. They flagged the following behavioral markers. Killer was likely male, age range 30-50. Demonstrated control during the killings. Left no overt message or signature, but possible symbolic staging. Comfortable operating in rural terrain. Likely familiar with firearms and post-firearm handling. May have had brief interaction with victims prior to murder. This led to 2 working hypotheses. 1, the killer knew the women personally, possibly through work or town contact. 2, the killer was a stranger, but had watched them long enough to execute a controlled double homicide. Either way, forensic timelines aligned with a calculated act. The killer came prepared, moved silently, and left with no intention of being identified. This is where forensic evidence stops becoming data and starts becoming story. Not one of emotion, but of decisions, movement, control. In towns like Moab, murders don't vanish because of chaos. They vanish because someone planned for order. Moab wasn't equipped for this kind of case. The town had fewer than 6,000 residents, and violent crime was rare enough to be almost anecdotal. Most calls to dispatch involved off-road vehicle accidents, lost hikers, or disputes over campsite boundaries. The double homicide of Kylan Schulte and Crystal Turner changed that overnight, forcing local law enforcement into a type of casework they weren't trained to lead. Organized murder, with no clear suspect, no physical confrontation, and no motive left on scene. By August 21st, the Grand County Sheriff's Office was coordinating with the Utah State Bureau of Investigation and the FBI. Resources had to be pulled from Salt Lake City. A temporary task force was formed, but the structural reality remained. This was a small agency dealing with a large-scale forensic case. The primary obstacle was the lack of actionable witness testimony. No one in town had reported seeing either woman after they left Woody's Tavern on August 13th. Their interactions at the bar were unremarkable. Surveillance footage showed no visible pursuit, no stranger approaching them, no individual lingering behind. The creepy guy Killen had mentioned to friends was still a phantom. No description, no contact history, no lead. The victim's routines didn't help narrow the field. Kylan worked part-time at Moonflower Co-op, a grocery spot popular with tourists and transients. Crystal had recently been employed at McDonald's on South Main. Both jobs had high customer turnover. Security footage from those workplaces showed dozens of regulars, but none flagged by co-workers as suspicious. Detectives cross-referenced employee rosters and recent terminations. No hits. Nothing that could be tied to a confrontation or an escalating dispute. Investigators began mapping every known campsite within a 3-mile radius of the crime scene. This wasn't just about finding possible witnesses. It was about understanding proximity behavior. Who had been close enough to observe the victim's patterns? In the wilderness, sightlines mattered more than addresses. That's when the first secondary forensic anomaly surfaced. A makeshift fire pit near a neighboring clearing, roughly 500 yards uphill from Kylan and Crystal's camp. The fire was cold but intact. Partially burned food wrappers, cigarette butts, and a crushed energy drink can were recovered. No biological evidence, no fingerprints, but one item stood out, a scrap of cardboard bearing the phrase, "Stop being loud," written in faded Sharpie. It wasn't proof, but it was documented and logged. Forensic techs sent the cardboard for handwriting analysis. It wouldn't yield results in time to affect the initial investigation, but it underscored a deeper concern. Someone else had been camping close by. Close enough to hear, possibly close enough to watch. Cell tower dumps from August 13th and 14 were being processed in parallel. The FBI's digital forensics team received raw data from Verizon and AT&T. A total of 37 unique devices pinged towers within range of LaSalle Loop Road during that 24-hour period. Of those, 32 were traced to tourists, residents, and delivery drivers. 5 remained unassigned: burner phones, deactivated lines, or SIM-less units. This is where the investigation stalled. No suspect, no direct link, no second scene. The lab results had been clean. No DNA outside the victims. No recovered weapon. No license plate cameras on the mountain access roads. But law enforcement had enough behavioral indicators to begin building a working profile. They weren't looking for someone who snapped. They were looking for someone who planned. A person who could remain still for hours, close to a campsite, with a weapon and a reason to use it. Someone who understood how to remain invisible in an area with few people and fewer cameras. That was the biggest vulnerability, the openness of the place. National parks, campgrounds, remote trails, they offer privacy, but also exposure. No doors, no neighbors, no surveillance. That duality was now a point of failure. Investigators believed the killer had spent time in that area before the murders, possibly even days. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit updated the profile to include local familiarity. The suspect wasn't just someone who could shoot, they were someone who could wait. A quiet observation emerged from one of the investigators. This wasn't someone who panicked. This was someone who finished what they came for. As the investigation widened, community response in Moab fractured. Some residents blamed tourists. Others blamed the town's growing transient population. There were questions about police resources, about why the women's concerns weren't taken seriously when they mentioned being watched. That social failure lingered, quietly, behind every press release. Because Kylan had spoken up. She told people she didn't feel safe, and no one followed through. It raised a broader issue beyond the case. What communities choose to dismiss because it's inconvenient to confront. In a place built on escape, there was now a question about what had been escaping notice all along. 6 weeks into the investigation, the case file was heavy but fragile. Hundreds of pages of forensic logs, digital pings, and psychological profiles, but no name that linked cleanly to motive or opportunity. Then a lead surfaced not from a blood trail or fingerprint, but from a payroll system. Crystal Turner had worked the grill at McDonald's on South Main Street in Moab. She wasn't new, but she hadn't been there long enough to leave much paperwork. When detectives reviewed her employment records more closely, They noted a former coworker, Adam Pinkasiewicz. He had worked the same shifts, sometimes overlapping. He was listed as having voluntarily quit in July 2021, just weeks before the murders. His HR file showed no formal complaints but included comments from management noting inappropriate behavior, paranoia, and difficulty with female authority. The records weren't damning, but they weren't clean either. He had left without notice, told no one where he was going, and stopped answering messages from other employees. Detectives flagged the name. A quiet review of his background began. Adam was 45, originally from Colorado. No felony record. A few misdemeanors for disorderly conduct. Nothing that would have triggered any watch list. He'd been living in Moab temporarily, renting a room above a repair shop, but had vanished after mid-August, just days after Killen and Crystal were killed. There was no warrant, and no one had reported him missing, but the timing was too sharp to ignore. The team reached out to his last known contact, a man in Colorado who said Adam had crashed on his couch briefly in early September. He'd left again after 2 days. That was the last anyone had seen him. Then the case broke sideways. On September 18, 2021, a decomposing body was discovered in a roadside motel room in Waterloo, Iowa. The guest had checked in under his real name. The cause of death? Self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head. No suicide note. A .9mm handgun was recovered on the nightstand. Ballistics were run as a matter of routine. When results came back 2 weeks later, the firing pattern matched the bullets extracted from Kylan and Crystal's bodies. The gun used in Adam Pinkasiewicz's suicide was the same weapon used to kill them. That connection rewired the case. Now, Adam wasn't just a former coworker who had disappeared. He was linked by ballistics to a double homicide. The FBI reopened their psychological profile. Investigators looked at Adam's past behavior with sharper focus. A former partner in Colorado said he'd become increasingly paranoid in recent years. Distrustful, isolated. There were references to women being controlling, to feeling humiliated at work. The interview wasn't emotional, it was methodical, but it changed the texture of the file. One detail stood out. A comment Adam allegedly made 2 weeks before leaving Moab. "Some people just don't know when to shut up." That phrase was consistent with a phrase he'd written on a burned piece of cardboard found near the crime scene. Forensics had tested it for handwriting. Results came back inconclusive. But the phrasing, the tone, the timing, they aligned. By early November, investigators had what they needed. They could no longer arrest Adam, he was dead. But the evidence was mounting into a timeline that made legal sense. Presence, opportunity, weapon match, behavior, exit. The Department of Public Safety released a statement confirming that Adam Pinkasiewicz would have been charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder had he been alive. The case wasn't officially closed yet, but it had a name. There was no courtroom, no confession, no answer to the lingering why. But the path had finally narrowed. The call came from Waterloo, Iowa on September 18, 2021. A motel employee entered room 107 after the occupant failed to check out. Inside, they found a man dead from a gunshot wound to the head. No struggle, no second party. A single round discharged from a 9mm handgun recovered at the scene beside the bed. The body had been there for at least 48 hours. He'd checked in under his real name, Adam Pinkasiewicz. The coroner's report was clear. Manner of death, suicide. Toxicology showed no substances in his system. His wallet was intact. The room showed no signs of disarray. 1 duffel bag, some basic clothes, a phone with no SIM card, a second older flip phone, powered off, and the weapon. It would be the only thing that mattered. The Iowa State Patrol ran a standard trace. The gun came back unregistered. No sale on file, no registration in Adam's name. But ballistics processing flagged the weapon for testing against open homicide investigations. That's when it hit Utah's database. The markings on the bullets recovered from Kylan Schulte and Crystal Turner's autopsies, specifically the unique striation pattern left by the barrel's lands and grooves, matched the weapon found next to Adam's body. Not similar, identical. The forensic report issued by the Utah Department of Public Safety noted a 100% match between rifling characteristics, firing pin impressions, and extractor marks. There was no longer any doubt. The man who had worked beside Crystal Turner in a Moab McDonald's weeks before she was killed had used the same weapon to end his own life in another state. Interstate coordination followed. Utah's investigators flew to Iowa, retrieved the weapon, and reviewed the scene alongside local authorities. There were no signs of a struggle, no indication anyone else had been present. The motel's surveillance footage, which had only partial coverage of the hallway, showed Adam entering alone. No one followed. The weapon was processed again at Utah's lab for additional trace evidence. One small fiber, nylon dark blue, was extracted from the slide catch. It was consistent with the fibers collected from Crystal Turner's outer jacket. No DNA, no blood, but the physical match added a final layer of forensic alignment. The room contained no confession, no explanation, but one item stood out: a torn notebook page in the trash. It had no handwriting, just a list of dates and first names. One of them was Crystal, another was Kylan. The page was incomplete, partially burned along one edge, but it was preserved as evidence. The FBI's behavioral analysts reviewed the Iowa scene photos and cross-compared it with the Utah case file. The conclusion: Pinkasiewicz fit the profile. The crime had been deliberate, controlled, and brief. His suicide, by contrast, suggested isolation and mental disintegration. No escape route, no secondary plan. From a legal standpoint, the Utah case couldn't proceed to prosecution. The suspect was dead, but the case was not considered unsolved. The district attorney's office issued a formal statement in December 2022, confirming that had Adam Pinkasiewicz been alive, he would have faced 2 charges of aggravated murder. The file was administratively closed under the legal term exceptionally cleared. For the families, there was no courtroom, no cross-examination, no final word. There was just an ending they didn't get to witness. But what made this case so particularly difficult wasn't just that the killer had died. It was that the reason behind the act had gone with him. No manifesto, no phone calls, no social media trail. The digital evidence from Adam's devices was minimal. One phone was wiped, the other had no stored contacts, no messages, no search history of value. The only insight came from those who had known him, brief relationships scattered across Colorado and Utah. Interviews conducted by agents painted a picture of an increasingly unstable man, socially withdrawn, distrustful of women, prone to anger when challenged, and obsessed with perceived disrespect. It wasn't a medical diagnosis. It wasn't a defense. It was a context. That context wouldn't bring back Kylan or Crystal, but it helped close the question that haunted every investigator on the case. Why them? Because they knew him. Because Crystal had worked alongside him. Because they had talked about feeling watched and were right. In most homicide investigations, physical evidence builds the frame, but it's testimony that fills the structure. That final layer came to the Schulte-Turner case not through the crime scene, but through a person no one expected to talk. Someone close to Adam Pinkasiewicz. In February 2022, nearly 5 months after his death, a former romantic partner of Adam's contacted law enforcement through an intermediary. The individual, whose name remains sealed in official records, requested to speak with investigators privately and under conditions of protection. This wasn't someone volunteering hearsay. This was someone who had first-hand conversations with Adam during the weeks leading up to the murders. The interview was recorded and later corroborated. According to the witness, Adam had made disturbing, specific comments regarding Crystal Turner. He had described her as bossy, judgmental, and loud. More concerning were his remarks that he had a way to fix that. The tone had been casual, delivered without emotion. Not a threat, but a statement. What made the interview credible wasn't just tone or timing, it was the details. The witness recalled Adam mentioning that the couple was camping alone in the LaSalle area. This detail had never been made public before the bodies were discovered. More importantly, Adam had described the murder in language that reflected actual crime scene findings. 2 shots to one victim, 3 to the other, both taken by surprise, didn't scream. The interview transcript confirmed he'd never named Kylan or Crystal explicitly as victims, but everything else aligned: location, relationship, number of shots, behavioral motive, and aftermath. He allegedly told the witness he left Utah to get ahead of the noise. When asked what that meant, Adam had simply said, "They'll never know unless I tell them." That statement remained chilling not because it was a confession in the legal sense, but because it was functionally accurate. Until that moment, investigators had relied solely on physical linkage, the gun, the timeline, and the employment overlap. This was the first verbal connection, indirect but authenticated. Forensic psychologists reviewed the statements and flagged several consistencies with known offender behavior. Adams' language had followed a classic post-crime dissociation pattern: minimizing, reframing blame, refusing responsibility while maintaining control of the narrative. He wasn't confessing out of guilt. He was rationalizing it to someone he believed wouldn't report him. What stood out wasn't his violence, it was his indifference. In March 2022, the FBI reclassified the case status from open to resolved by death of offender. Internally, the investigative team marked the interview transcript as the final piece needed to close the file with confidence. The statement, while not admissible in a court proceeding due to hearsay protections and the suspect's death, supported the existing forensic matrix. There was no trial, no opportunity to confront, no cross-examination, but there was closure, legal if not emotional. From a criminal justice standpoint, the case had met all thresholds. Identified offender, confirmed weapon, behavioral match, direct post-event statements. The only element missing was a formal confession from Adam himself. But in the absence of that, the indirect one, timed, detailed, and voluntarily shared, carried significant weight. That's often how real homicide cases resolve, not with dramatic reveals or courtroom confrontations, but with small details that accumulate until the line between suspicion and certainty becomes statistically indistinguishable. It was never about a single clue. It was about total convergence. By October 2022, nearly 14 months after the discovery of the two bodies in the LaSalle Mountains, the Grand County Sheriff's Office publicly identified the suspect, Adam Pinkusiewicz, a former employee at the same McDonald's where Kylan Schultz worked. The name wasn't unfamiliar. Early in the investigation, Pinkusiewicz had briefly surfaced as a potential witness. He had abruptly left Moab just days after the murders, allegedly telling someone he needed to get out of town. But without direct evidence or probable cause at the time, investigators had no basis to detain or locate him. That changed in 2022 when detectives acquired a statement from an individual who had spoken to Pinkusiewicz after he fled Utah. This individual claimed Pinkusiewicz confessed to the murders in private, citing vague grievances and personal hatred toward Kylan and Crystal. Alongside the confession, authorities located digital evidence that linked him to the vicinity of the campsite at the time of the killings, including cell phone records and GPS data, placing him near South Mesa on August 14, 2021. Despite the breakthrough, Pinkusiewicz would never stand trial. In late 2021, he died by suicide in another state, months before the Grand County Sheriff's Office formally identified him as the primary suspect. His death meant there would be no confession in court, no direct cross-examination, no public admission of motive. The case was technically cleared by exception. For Kylan and Crystal's families, the closure was incomplete. The sheriff's office offered a statement expressing confidence in the suspect's guilt, citing his confession, timeline, digital footprint, and unexplained flight from the area. But the absence of forensic evidence, no murder weapon recovered, no fingerprints, no DNA, meant some questions would remain unanswered indefinitely. There were no known prior reports of conflict between Pinkusiewicz and the victims, though colleagues described him as volatile, erratic, and socially isolated. According to law enforcement, he had reportedly expressed interest in harming women and made bizarre, paranoid comments in the weeks leading up to his disappearance. Still, the why behind his actions, why them, why there, why so brutal, remains speculative. In the aftermath, the case ignited conversations across Utah and beyond about safety for LGBT+ individuals in remote communities. Kylan and Crystal had been openly affectionate, loving, and visible. Their vulnerability, camping alone in the desert, away from surveillance or neighbors, may have made them targets. The investigation reinforced the reality that hate doesn't always wear a label, and sometimes violence comes from the fringes no one is watching. Law enforcement emphasized the challenges of this case, Delayed discovery, minimal physical evidence, and a suspect who actively evaded questioning. But the digital trail and a single confession shared with a third party gave just enough to close the file. Their loved ones continue to advocate for broader protection, inclusion, and mental health awareness in isolated areas. Friends launched foundations in their names, holding vigils each August 18 to mark the day they were found, not just to grieve, but to insist they are not forgotten. Even though this story ends with a name in a file and a case closed by exception, we know true closure is much harder to come by. For those of us who followed every headline, every update, and every unanswered question, we carry something forward. If there's one thing I've learned, it's this. Evil doesn't always wear a warning sign, and sometimes the people we overlook are the ones who do the most damage. Stay aware, protect each other, and never assume a quiet place is always a safe place. Have you ever felt like a detail in someone else's story? Like your truth didn't matter until it was too late? Let me know in the comments where you're watching from, or share what this story meant to you. If this video touched something in you, or even made you uncomfortable in a necessary way, I'd love to hear your perspective. And if you're new here, consider subscribing. Your voice matters, and so do these stories.